secret codes, spy networks, and a Bond girl of sorts who became the most unlikely ancestor of Jesus Christ. Let us pray. Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight, my goodness and my fortress, my high tower and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I trust. Amen. It's February 28th, 1942. Having just read a newspaper article about the U.S. Army enlisting members of the Comanche tribe as secret code talkers, a civil engineer named Philip Johnston tries to convince the U.S. Marine Corps to do the same thing, except instead of using Comanche, he wants them to consider using Navajo. Growing up in Flagstaff, Arizona, Philip learned to speak fluent Navajo as he played with children living on the reservation nearby. He sees the great potential of using their language as a secret code because it is one of the most difficult to learn. Navajo is strictly verbal. There is no alphabet, so you can't read or write their language. You just have to hear the words and memorize them. Navajo is also a tonal language. For example, hello, 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 hello. In English, that's all the same word. In Navajo, a two-syllable pairing could be 4 totally different words depending on the pitch and modulation. The Marines were impressed with Philip's demonstration, and they started using native Navajo speakers to develop an unbreakable code. For individual letters, they used Navajo words that, when translated into English, start with that respective letter. The Navajo words for ant, apple, and axe became code for the English letter A. To make code words for military resources, they had to get a little more creative. For example, the Navajo word for hummingbird became code for fighter plane. Even if the enemy got someone who spoke fluent Navajo and English, unless that person knew the secret code, the messages would just seem like a bunch of nonsense. In the Battle of Saipan, a group of Marines was taking accidental friendly fire from an artillery unit. They radioed for the shelling to stop, but since the Japanese were known to send out fake radio transmissions, the shelling continued. The U.S. command post responded to the outreach by saying, "Do you have a Navajo?" Well, sure enough, they did, and that code talker got on the radio and, in his native language, he yells, "Sheep, turkey, onion, pig, eggs, weasel, ear, apple, rabbit, elk, our mother." The Navajo guy back at the U.S. command post gets the message loud and clear. Stop bombing. We are Americans. Voila, shelling stopped. Together, those 2 Navajo code talkers saved that entire group of Marines. That story is a beautiful square in a larger historical quilt of secret codes and spies saving the day. Holding our figurative quilts, let's now take a look at the square dated August 25th, 1778. The Continental Army has lost control of New York. George Washington's spies have a 60% failure rate. Something has to change, so Washington calls for the establishment of a new secret spy organization called the Culper Ring. It has 6 key members. All 6 are from Long Island, New York. Most of them are childhood friends, but most of them are unaware of each other's involvement in the spy ring. It worked like an old school prayer chain. When I was a kid, our prayer chain was all done via landline telephone. Everybody at church knew each other, but as far as the prayer chain was concerned, you only knew the person who called your house and the person who you called next. You didn't know who all got the message before you or who all would get it after you. The Culper spy ring operated the same way. And that was on purpose because if one member got caught, you didn't want them to have knowledge of the entire group. The information traveling through this prayer chain of sorts begins with a merchant. He gathers intelligence from loose-lipped British officers who frequent his store. Using invisible ink, he writes notes between the lines on receipts and newspapers. This is where the phrase "read between the lines" comes from. Now, I got a D+ in high school chemistry. I couldn't tell you the molecular arrangement of invisible ink. All I know is you write words, they disappear, somebody applies a chemical, and the words appear again. I don't know how it works, it just does. Anyway, the merchant has a friend who owns a tavern. There's nothing suspicious about a tavern owner buying supplies. Well, while the tavern owner is shopping, the merchant prints a fake receipt with invisible ink. The tavern owner comes through the checkout line, collects the fake receipt, rides back home, and hides the paper in a cabbage field that he rents from a friend. A tavern probably serves bar food, bratwursts with sauerkraut, pulled pork barbecue sandwiches with coleslaw. You need cabbage to make sauerkraut and coleslaw. Nothing suspicious about someone who serves bar food renting land from a cabbage farmer. The cabbage farmer walks by the field later and collects the fake receipt. This guy has a friend who runs a whaling boat back and forth from Long Island to Connecticut. Pause. The cabbage farmer is also friends with a homemaker lady who lives next door. From her house, she can see when and where the whaling boat lands on the shore. When the homemaker puts her laundry on the clothesline, she'll hang a black petticoat if the whaler is in town. She'll also hang a certain number of handkerchiefs to indicate where the whaleboat is anchored. The cabbage farmer can see the homemaker's clothesline from his house. He sees the black petticoat, he counts the number of handkerchiefs, and this tells him where to meet the whaler. The cabbage farmer hands the fake receipt to the whaler, who then sails across the Long Island Sound to Connecticut. Safely in Connecticut, the whaler hands the fake receipt to another friend, a military officer, who delivers it to General Washington. Ta-da! Merchant, tavern owner, cabbage farmer, homemaker, whaler, military officer, General Washington. The Culper spy ring was crucial to the successful outcome of the war. This group exposed Benedict Arnold's treasonous plot to surrender West Point. They foiled a British attempt to inflate our currency with counterfeit money, and they disrupted British plans to ambush French reinforcements in Rhode Island. All of these things and more added up to our ultimate American victory. In our figurative quilt of stories about secret codes and espionage, you might assume that every spy thriller would have the spy emerge as the hero. But our final adventure turns conventional wisdom upside down. This square dates back to 1406 BC. 40 years after being freed from slavery in Egypt, the Hebrews are still wandering around the desert. After the death of Moses, Joshua has been installed as the new leader, and God decides that this will be the guy to finally bring the Hebrew people to the Promised Land. Joshua chapter 2 begins by saying that 2 Hebrew spies are sent secretly to scout the land of Canaan, especially the city of Jericho. Emphasis on the words "to" and "secretly." You would think that all spy missions would be top secret, but that wasn't the case. Years earlier, Moses had sent 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. When the spies returned, 2 of them were confident about victory, but they were outvoted by the other 10 who were scared. News of their pessimistic report spread rapidly, and public opinion amongst the Hebrews turned sharply against launching an attack. Joshua won't repeat Moses' mistake. Joshua will send just 2 spies, and he'll do so secretly. To give you a lay of the land, the Hebrews are camping out in Acacia Grove, Shittim, just east of the Jordan River. The west side of the Jordan River is the land of Canaan. The first city you come to is Jericho, and beyond that is hill country. Canaan had a pagan culture with 2 very disgusting practices. I'm not going to sugarcoat this because I think you should know exactly why God chose to bring his wrath on these people. To appease their man-made gods, the Canaanites engaged in child sacrifice. They would take babies, slit their throats, and throw them into a fire. Any adults who didn't have kids could purchase them from families that had multiple kids. In the process of selling her child, if the mother started crying, her baby was still sacrificed, but she had to forfeit the money from the sale. Trying to cover up the harsh reality of their barbarism, during these child murders, flutes and drums were playing really loud so you couldn't hear the screaming. Before throwing the babies in the fire, these leaders put a grinning mask on them, making it look like the babies enjoyed it. There were no limits to Canaanite treachery. In addition to child sacrifice, they had child prostitution in the temples. Local men coming for worship and foreign emissaries coming for diplomacy could enter the temple and rape these little girls. Despicable. Joshua's orders to scout Jericho had nothing to do with the fact that it's the first city you come to across the Jordan River. This wasn't about convenience. This was about God's wrath. Well, the two Hebrew spies enter Jericho through the main gate on the east side. Moseying over to the west end of town, they find themselves in the red light district. It's there that they meet a Bond girl of sorts, a woman named Rahab. In Ian Fleming's novels, many of the Bond girls are survivors of sexual violence sometime in the past. They work taboo jobs until one day they meet a spy and become invested in his mission. That's Rahab. Some scholars believe she might have been forced into child prostitution in the temple. After years of abuse, she probably lost hope of her life ever amounting to anything more. This likely led to what we know of her profession as an adult when she's introduced to us in Joshua chapter 2. The Bible repeatedly labels her Rahab the Harlot. Rahab was once a little girl like my Charlotte Josephine. She had little girl dreams. Charlotte dreams of living in a magical casita like Mirabel Madrigal from the Disney movie Encanto. She dreams of becoming a music teacher like Miss Rachel Accurso, who she watches on YouTube. She doesn't dream of becoming a prostitute. Well, neither did Rahab, yet here we are. The Hebrew spies figure that the red light district is a good place to gather intel because people's lips will be loose and because they can remain anonymous. Well, unfortunately for the spies, they weren't as discreet as they hoped. Some little birdie saw them entering Rahab's house, and that little birdie informed the king of Jericho that enemy spies had infiltrated the city walls. Well, shortly after, there's a knock at Rahab's door. Police, open up. Just a minute. Well, Rahab has a sunny rooftop deck that she uses to dry out stalks of harvested flax, which can be turned into linen fabric, among other things. She hides the spies on the roof and then comes down to answer the door. The officer says, "Bring out the two men who entered your house." This is a brothel. You're going to have to be a little more specific than that. Fair enough. Two Hebrew men came to your house. They're enemy spies. Bring them out now. Oh, those two men. I didn't know they were Hebrew spies. Oh, they left here around sunset and headed out the eastern gate. I'm not sure where they went from there, but if you hurry, you might be able to catch them. She's lying. Well, the police believe her story, so they head out the eastern gate and go on a wild goose chase. Well, once the coast is clear, Rahab goes up to her rooftop deck and has a heart-to-heart talk with the Hebrew spies. She says, "We've heard about you guys. And more than that, we've heard about your God. We heard how God parted the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. We heard how you smote two kingdoms east of the Jordan River." And notice how Rahab keeps using the plural we. We, everyone in Jericho, heard about your God. But despite that knowledge, everybody else wants to get rid of you, but I have made a different decision than the culture. I choose to align myself with your God. The culture approves of slaughtering babies and doing other disgusting acts, but I'm not choosing the crowd. I'm choosing the Lord, even if that means I find myself by myself. Rahab knows that if she follows the culture, she'll go down with the culture. Rahab chooses God over the crowd. It's at this point that she strikes a deal with the spies. She says, "Listen, I just saved you two from being killed. When your army comes to Jericho, I want to promise that you won't kill me and you won't kill my family." The spies reply, "Our lives for yours. If you promise to keep quiet about what we're doing, we promise to treat you kindly when the Lord gives us this land." Deal. Rahab's house was built into the western wall. She has the spies use a scarlet cord to rappel down from the window and escape. Rahab sent the police heading east towards the Jordan River, so she tells the spies to head west and hide out in the hill country for 3 days and then return to Acacia Grove. Before they go, though, they hash out the details of how Rahab and her family are going to be saved during the battle. After they've rappelled down, the spies tell Rahab to take that scarlet cord and tie it to her window. That will be the sign not to demolish this property. The spies say you and everyone in your family have to be inside your house. Anybody who steps outside your house is fair game. And that scarlet cord has to be in the window. Don't leave it on the sofa, okay? Deal. Remember that scarlet cord because we'll come back to it later. Well, much like he parted the Red Sea, God lowers the water of the Jordan River so the Hebrew people can finally enter the Promised Land. Their army surrounds Jericho, and God brings the walls tumbling down, except for one little section in the red light district on the west end of town. God saved the house of Rahab the harlot. You're left with a sense of happily ever after, but what does that really mean? Picture yourself on Christmas Eve listening to the nativity story from Luke's Gospel. Caesar Augustus calls for a census of the empire. Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, goes from Nazareth to Bethlehem because he belongs to the lineage of King David. This genealogy is spelled out in Matthew chapter 1, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, Luke chapter 3, and Ruth chapter 4. They're very boring lists until you get to a stretch of 5 names. Jesus' mother Mary is wed to Joseph, who traces back to King David. David's father was Jesse. Next is Obed, then Boaz, and then a man named Salmon, whose wife is Rahab the harlot. After Jericho was destroyed, this Gentile prostitute from a pagan city meets and falls in love with a Jewish man named Salmon, and on Christmas Eve we're reminded that the ancestry of Jesus Christ includes a harlot. As a high school graduation gift, my best friend Jake planned a road trip for the two of us to visit the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. Each inductee has a bronze bust with their name and bio underneath. And you'll see legendary names like Bob Greasy, Walter Payton, Vince Lombardi, and John Madden. In Hebrews chapter 11, we find what's often referred to as the Hall of Faith. The bio for every inductee begins with, by faith, so-and-so did this. By faith, so-and-so did that. By faith, so-and-so did the other thing. Just like it's no surprise to see famous people like John Madden and others in the Hall of Fame, it's no surprise to see people like Noah, Abraham, and Moses in the Hall of Faith. But then you scroll down to verse 31, which says, by faith, Rahab the harlot was saved when she received the spies with peace. Right there with all these other legendary names, Rahab the harlot is in the Hall of Faith. This beautiful story of salvation by faith really hits home when you think back to that scarlet cord. Having Rahab tie the scarlet cord to her window was not a coincidence. In Exodus chapter 12, when God's wrath was descending upon Egypt, the Hebrew slaves had to mark their door frames with the blood of a lamb. God saves the people who, by faith, choose the blood as their identification. 40 years later, that scarlet cord in Rahab's window looked an awful lot like the blood of a lamb on a doorframe. When God's wrath was descending upon Jericho, he saves the people who, by faith, choose this symbol as their identification. And that scarlet cord runs from Jericho's red light district all the way to the foot of the cross, where Rahab's great-grandson, Jesus Christ, becomes the perfect lamb who was slain. We don't receive the gift of salvation by memorizing 411 Navajo secret code words. God bless the people who did that, but that's not a ticket to heaven. We don't receive the gift of salvation by smuggling fake receipts that contain messages with invisible ink all across the Long Island countryside. God bless the people who did that, but it's not a ticket to heaven. By faith, we must choose the blood of the Lamb as our identification. By faith, we must choose to have that scarlet cord tied so firmly to the window of our soul that there's no way it can be overlooked. Oh, Jay, you don't understand. There's some flattering stuff in my past. God could never save a wretch like me. God could never redeem a sinner like me. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. By faith, Rahab the harlot was saved. Amen.